L'Algérie vient officiellement de prendre ses premières sanctions économiques contre la France en mettant fin à toute importation du blé français dans le marché algérien, considéré comme l'un des plus importants au monde. L'information annoncée par Reuters met à mal la France qui perd des centaines de millions d'euros de contrats avec l'Algérie. Cette décision algérienne intervient à
If I told you that Algeria just made a move so bold, it could rewrite the power dynamics between Africa and Europe forever. That by expelling French officials, they weren't just reacting to politics, they were making a loud, unapologetic statement.
A diplomatic row is brewing between France and another African nation, another former French colony. This time the fight is with Algeria. France is having a meltdown because Algeria is not toeing the line.
I would like to express my surprise, and I think that we have reached an extremely worrying threshold with Algeria. It is clear that Algeria is seeking to humiliate France.
Algerian lawmakers are heading to parliament where they are set to debate a new draft law that would criminalize 130 years of French colonial rule. Here's what we know. The bill aims to classify the period of French colonization as a crime and to recognize the atrocities and repression Algerians suffered under French rule, which began back.
For more than a century, the land carried memory like sediment beneath its soil. Ports expanded, mines deepened, rail lines stretched across deserts, and foreign balance sheets quietly grew fat from resources extracted far from European capitals. The arrangement was old, polished by repetition, and disguised as partnership. It survived wars, regime changes, and global financial crises because it was profitable and predictable. Or so it seemed. Algeria had learned patience. Independence did not immediately mean control, and sovereignty did not instantly dismantle economic architecture designed during colonial rule. Contracts signed decades earlier remained. Active ownership structures stayed offshore. Technology, insurance, shipping, and pricing mechanisms were still dictated elsewhere. Flags had changed, but influence had not. What shifted was not anger, but arithmetic. By the time the decision came, it was no longer emotional or symbolic. It was calculated. Commodity prices had climbed. Alternative partners had multiplied. Domestic technical capacity had expanded quietly. Regional trade alliances were maturing. Energy corridors were diversifying. The dependency that once justified concession had weakened. European companies operating in Algeria had grown accustomed to extensions, renegotiations, and exemptions. Licenses were renewed with minimal resistance. Environmental obligations were deferred. Revenue-sharing clauses were adjusted in their favor under the logic of stability. The assumption was permanence. That assumption collapsed in a single policy cycle. The announcement did not arrive with drama. It came through regulatory notices, revised compliance frameworks, and enforcement timelines that could not be ignored. Operations were frozen pending review. Export approvals stalled. Port clearances slowed. Arbitration clauses were suspended under national interest provisions. Suddenly, decades of certainty dissolved into procedural limbo. European capitals reacted with disbelief. Statements were issued emphasizing history, partnership, and mutual benefit. Lobbyists arrived. Emergency delegations requested dialogue. Threats of investment withdrawal were quietly circulated. But the language no longer carried weight. Algeria had already priced the risk. The deeper shock came when it became clear the move was not isolated. Across Africa, similar reviews were underway. Mining concessions, energy contracts, agricultural leases, and logistics hubs were being reassessed under new frameworks prioritizing value retention and local processing. Algeria was not leading a rebellion. It was acting within a continental pattern that had matured beyond rhetoric. Europe felt the impact immediately. Supply chains tightened. Refineries adjusted output forecasts. Manufacturing firms faced higher input costs. Strategic stockpiles were quietly tapped. Insurance premiums rose. What had once been a reliable flow of materials became uncertain, conditional, and expensive. Within Algeria, the atmosphere was different. The expulsion of major European companies was not celebrated with spectacle. There were no parades or fiery speeches. The focus was administrative. Assets were audited. Facilities were transferred. New operational models were introduced, emphasizing joint ventures, domestic equity stakes, and technology transfer obligations. Critics warned of capital flight, analysts predicted collapse, ratings agencies expressed concern. None of it materialized as expected. New partners moved quickly, not out of ideology, but opportunity. Processing plants were proposed instead of raw export terminals. Local firms expanded, employment stabilized, revenue flows, while initially disrupted, rebounded with greater retention. For the first time in generations, value was being captured where extraction occurred. The most unsettling realization for Europe was not economic loss, but precedent. If Algeria could do this after 130 years of entanglement, others could follow, and many were already preparing to. What Europe had underestimated was time. Africa had been studying its partners, its markets, and itself. The continent understood leverage not as confrontation, but as optionality. The power came from having alternatives. Algeria's decision exposed a structural flaw in Europe's post-colonial engagement strategy. It relied on inertia. It assumed loyalty without renewal. It treated access as entitlement rather than privilege. The response from European institutions was fragmented. Some advocated compromise, others urged pressure. A few quietly began renegotiating their own exposure elsewhere. But unity was elusive and credibility weaker than expected. Inside Algeria, the narrative was simple. The land had paid its dues. The extraction phase was over. The future would be negotiated on different terms. This was not isolationism. Exports continued, trade expanded, but the hierarchy had changed. Access now required alignment with national priorities. Profit had to coexist with participation. The global market adjusted, as it always does. Prices shifted, routes rerouted, alliances recalibrated. What could not be reversed was the psychological break. The idea that African resources were permanently accessible under legacy arrangements was gone. Algeria had demonstrated that sovereignty, once postponed, could still be exercised with precision rather than chaos. For Europe, the lesson arrived late but clear. History does not guarantee access. Influence does not survive neglect, and partnership without respect eventually expires. Algeria did not rewrite the global order alone, but it proved something fundamental. The age of inherited advantage had ended, and the future of global resources would belong to those who negotiated, not those who assumed. The months that followed the departure of major European companies marked a period of controlled uncertainty. Algeria did not rush to fill every gap left behind. Instead, it allowed the vacuum to exist long enough to expose what had previously been hidden. For decades, foreign operators had positioned themselves as indispensable. Their exit revealed that much of that indispensability had been overstated. Ports continued to function. Energy flowed. Mines did not collapse into silence. What changed was the destination of decisions. Authority that once sat in distant boardrooms shifted inward, into ministries, regional councils, and newly formed regulatory bodies. The transition was imperfect, sometimes slow, but unmistakably deliberate. Europe's initial reaction hardened into strategy. Governments attempted to coordinate responses through trade pressure, legal challenges, and diplomatic appeals. Arbitration courts were invoked. Old agreements were scrutinized line by line. Yet many of those agreements were anchored in a world that no longer existed. Clauses written under asymmetrical conditions proved difficult to enforce against a state acting within its sovereign framework. As legal battles stalled, economic consequences intensified. Manufacturers across Europe faced mounting costs. Aluminum, phosphates, gas derivatives, and rare industrial inputs became less predictable, long-term. Supply contracts were replaced by spot purchases at higher prices. Smaller firms suffered first, followed by mid-sized exporters that had built margins on stable African access. Inflationary pressure crept through supply chains, quiet at first, then undeniable. In Algeria, the conversation shifted from defense to ambition. New policies emphasized domestic refinement and downstream processing. Raw exports were no longer prioritized. Finished and semi-finished goods were. Industrial zones expanded near extraction sites. Training programs accelerated. Universities aligned curricula with industrial needs. The objective was not self-sufficiency, but leverage through value. Regional neighbors watched closely. What Algeria demonstrated was not defiance, but feasibility. It showed that restructuring relationships with former colonial powers did not automatically lead to isolation or collapse. It showed that diversification reduced vulnerability. and it showed that the global market was willing to adapt when presented with clarity and consistency. Across Africa, policy reviews deepened. States that had once competed against one another for European contracts began coordinating standards. Environmental requirements, labor protections, and local equity rules started to converge. The fragmentation that had long weakened negotiating power slowly narrowed. Africa was not acting as a single bloc, but it was no longer acting alone. Europe sensed the shift too late, decades of viewing Africa primarily as a supplier rather than a partner had limited Europe's strategic imagination. When access tightened, there were few alternatives ready at scale. Efforts to secure resources elsewhere ran into geopolitical resistance, logistical complexity, and higher costs. The world had become crowded with demand. Within Algeria, public perception evolved cautiously. There was pride, but also scrutiny. Citizens demanded that the gains translate into visible improvements. Infrastructure projects were expected to materialize. Employment figures were watched closely. The narrative of sovereignty carried weight only if accompanied by tangible outcomes. That pressure became a stabilizing force. Unlike earlier eras, the government could not attribute shortcomings solely to external interference. Control brought accountability. Missteps were debated openly. Adjustments were made. Transparency, once optional, became necessary. The most profound change, however, was psychological. For generations, economic planning had been shaped by anticipation of external approval. Investment decisions were often justified by foreign confidence. Rather than domestic need, that orientation reversed. International interest became a bonus, not a prerequisite. Europe's internal debate grew sharper. Some voices argued for genuine recalibration, fairer terms, technology sharing, long-term co-development. Others clung to nostalgia, insisting that influence could be restored through pressure or incentives alone. The split weakened cohesion and slowed response. Meanwhile, global actors outside Europe adapted swiftly. They did not approach Algeria with entitlement. They came with proposals aligned to national frameworks, aware that access required accommodation. The competition among partners worked in Algeria's favor, improving terms without confrontation. The old fear that rejecting entrenched powers would scare away all investment proved unfounded. Investment did not vanish. It evolved. As the years passed, the ripple effects widened. Trade flows across the Mediterranean adjusted permanently. Europe diversified supply chains, but at higher cost and lower efficiency. Africa retained a greater share of resource value, slowly altering income distribution patterns. The asymmetry that had defined the post-colonial era narrowed, not through conflict, but through recalibration. Algeria's move became a case study rather than an anomaly. It was cited in policy circles, academic research, and closed-door negotiations across the global south. Not because it was flawless, but because it was decisive. It proved that historical dependency was not destiny. The world did not fracture, it reorganized. The conclusion of this shift was not written in headlines, but in contracts, budgets, and trade statistics. Influence no longer flowed automatically from history. It flowed from relevance. Europe learned that stability without renewal breeds fragility. Africa demonstrated that patience combined with preparation can yield leverage without chaos. Algeria did not erase 130 years of history. It redefined what followed it. The relationship between Africa and Europe did not end. It matured under new rules. Access became negotiated. Partnerships became conditional. Respect became measurable. In the end, the lesson extended far beyond one country or one continent. Power in the modern world is not seized. It is structured. It does not announce itself loudly. It embeds itself quietly. Those who adapt remain influential. Those who rely on legacy eventually face correction. Algeria chose correction, and in doing so, it signaled that the age of inherited economic privilege had closed, replaced by an era where sovereignty is not declared, but exercised. The world adjusted accordingly. What unfolded was not a rupture but a recalibration. The departure of major European companies from Algeria marked the closing of a long historical chapter, but it also opened a new one defined by choice rather than inheritance. The significance of the moment lay not in confrontation, but in the quiet confidence with which decisions were executed and sustained. For Algeria, the shift represented more than economic restructuring. It was a psychological transition from reaction to authorship. For generations, development strategies had been shaped around external expectations and approval. By reclaiming control over resources, contracts, and long-term planning, the country reoriented its future. Inward without turning away from the world. Engagement continued, but under terms aligned with national priorities. Europe's response revealed the limits of influence built on habit. Appeals to history and partnership could not substitute for equity and adaptability. The shock experienced across European markets was not solely the result of resource constraints, but of an overdue recognition that access is no longer guaranteed. In a global system shaped by competition and diversification, legacy relationships demand renewal or risk erosion. The broader implications extended beyond bilateral relations. Algeria's actions echoed across Africa, reinforcing a growing consensus that sovereignty in the modern era is exercised through economic architecture as much as political symbolism. By prioritizing value retention, domestic capacity, and strategic optionality, African states demonstrated that development need not depend on concession. This transition was not without complexity. Greater control brought heightened accountability. Citizens expected tangible improvements in livelihoods, infrastructure, and opportunity. The margin for error narrowed as responsibility expanded. Yet this pressure strengthened governance rather than weakening it. Ownership fostered scrutiny, and scrutiny encouraged discipline. What unsettled global observers most was the absence of crisis. Markets adjusted, trade flows rerouted, new partnerships formed. The feared collapse did not materialize because the foundation had been prepared long in advance. Algeria's strategy succeeded precisely because it was gradual, methodical, and grounded in realism. The lesson for the international system was unmistakable. Stability built on imbalance is temporary. Endurance requires mutual benefit and respect for agency. As global power disperses, influence belongs increasingly to those who offer collaboration rather than control. Africa's evolving role challenges outdated narratives. The continent is no longer defined by extraction alone, nor by dependency. It is shaping trade, technology, and diplomacy with increasing coherence. Algeria's decision did not isolate it. It repositioned it within a world that values resilience and choice. For Europe, adaptation remains possible. Genuine partnership, equitable investment, and long-term cooperation can still rebuild trust. But such engagement must begin with recognition that the era of unilateral advantage has passed. In this moment of transition, the future is not predetermined. It will be negotiated through policy, performance, and credibility. Algeria's experience stands as evidence that sovereignty exercised with patience can transform relationships without destabilizing the system. History did not end. It evolved. The world moved forward not because power changed hands abruptly, but because it was redistributed through deliberate choice. And in that redistribution, a new balance emerged, one grounded in autonomy, accountability, and the understanding that true partnership begins when all parties possess the freedom to say no.